The Steppes and Siberia, the making of a Russian empire. At the same time as Western Europeans were building their empires in the Americas, the Russian Empire, which subsequently became the world's largest state, was beginning to take shape. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic, a small Russian state centered in the city of Moscow was emerging from 2 centuries of Mongol rule. That state soon conquered a number of neighboring Russian-speaking cities and incorporated them into its expanding territory. Located on the remote, cold, and heavily forested eastern fringe of Christendom, it was perhaps an unlikely candidate for constructing one of the great empires of the modern era. And yet, over the next 3 centuries, it did precisely that, extending Russian domination over the vast tundra, forests, and grasslands of northern Asia that lay to the south and east of Moscow, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Furthermore, Russians also expanded westward, bringing numerous Poles, Germans, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Baltic peoples into the Russian Empire. Russian attention was drawn first to the grasslands south and east of the Russian heartland, an area long inhabited by various nomadic pastoral peoples who were organized into feuding tribes and clans and adjusting to the recent disappearance of the Mongol Empire. From the viewpoint of the emerging Russian state, the problem was security, because these pastoral peoples, like the Mongols before them, frequently raided their agricultural Russian neighbors and sold many into slavery. To the east, across the vast expanse of Siberia, Russian motives were quite different, for the scattered peoples of its endless forests and tundra posed no threat to Russia. Numbering only some 220,000 in the 17th century and speaking more than 100 languages, they were mostly hunting, gathering, and herding people, living in small-scale societies and largely without access to gunpowder weapons. What drew the Russians across Siberia was opportunity, primarily the soft gold of fur-bearing animals, whose pelts were in great demand on the world market. Whatever motives drove it, this enormous Russian empire took shape in the 3 centuries between 1500 and 1800. A growing line of wooden forts offered protection to frontier towns and trading centers, as well as to mounting numbers of Russian farmers. Empire building was an extended process, involving the Russian state and its officials as well as a variety of private interests: merchants, hunters, peasants, churchmen, exiles, criminals, and adventurers. For the Russian migrants to these new eastern lands, the empire offered economic and social improvements over what they had known as home, from more and better land to fewer lords and officials. Political leaders and educated Russians generally defined the empire in grander terms, defending Russian frontiers, enhancing the power of the Russian state, and bringing Christianity, civilization, and enlightenment to savages. But what did that empire mean to those on its receiving end? Experiencing the Russian Empire. First, of course, empire meant conquest. Although resistance was frequent, especially from nomadic peoples, in the long run, Russian military might, based in modern weaponry and the organizational capacity of a state, brought both the steppes and Siberia under Russian control. Everywhere, Russian authorities demanded an oath of allegiance by which native people swore eternal submission to the Grand Tsar, the monarch of the Russian Empire. They also demanded yasak, or tribute, paid in cash or in kind. In Siberia, this meant enormous quantities of fur, especially the extremely valuable sable, which Siberian peoples were compelled to produce. As in the Americas, devastating epidemics accompanied conquest, particularly in the more remote regions of Siberia, where local people had little immunity to smallpox or measles. Also accompanying conquest was an intermittent pressure to convert to Christianity. Tax breaks, exemptions from paying tribute, and the promise of land or cash provided incentives for conversion, while the destruction of many mosques and the forced resettlement of Muslims added to the pressures. Yet the Russian state did not pursue conversion with the single-minded intensity that Spanish authorities exercised in Latin America, particularly if missionary activity threatened political and social stability. The Empress Catherine the Great, for example, established religious tolerance for Muslims in the late 18th century and created a state agency to oversee Muslim affairs. The most profoundly transforming feature of the Russian Empire was the influx of Russian settlers, whose numbers by the end of the 18th century had overwhelmed native peoples, giving their lands a distinctively Russian character. By 1720, some 700,000 Russians lived in Siberia, thus reducing the native Siberians to 30% of the total population, a proportion that dropped to 14% in the 19th century. The loss of hunting grounds and pasture lands to Russian agricultural settlers undermined long-standing economies and rendered local people dependent on Russian markets for grain, sugar, tea, tobacco, and alcohol. Pressures to encourage pastoralists to abandon their nomadic ways included the requirements to pay fees and to obtain permission to cross agricultural lands. Kazakh herders responded with outrage. The grass and the water belong to heaven, and why should we pay any fees? Intermarriage, prostitution, and sexual abuse resulted in some mixed-race offspring, but these were generally absorbed as Russians, rather than identified as distinctive communities, as in Latin America. Over the course of 3 centuries, both Siberia and the steppes were incorporated into the Russian state. Their native peoples were not driven into reservations or eradicated as in the Americas. Many of them, though, were Russified, adopting the Russian language and converting to Christianity, even as their traditional ways of life, hunting and herding, were much disrupted. The Russian Empire represented the final triumph of an agrarian civilization over the hunting societies of Siberia and over the pastoral peoples of the grasslands. Russians and Empire. If the empire transformed the conquered peoples, it also fundamentally changed Russia itself. Within an increasingly multi-ethnic empire, Russians diminished as a proportion of the overall population, although they remained politically dominant. Among the growing number of non-Russians in the empire, Slavic-speaking Ukrainians and Belarusians predominated, while the vast territories of Siberia and the steppes housed numerous separate peoples, but with quite small populations. The wealth of empire, rich agricultural lands, valuable furs, mineral deposits, played a major role in the making Russia one of the great powers of Europe by the 18th century, and it has enjoyed that position ever since. Unlike its expansion to the east, Russia's westward movement occurred in the context of military rivalries with the major powers of the region: the Ottoman Empire, Poland, Sweden, Lithuania, Prussia, and Austria. During the late 17th and 18th centuries, Russia acquired substantial territories in the Baltic region, Poland, and Ukraine. This contact with Europe also fostered an awareness of Russia's backwardness relative to Europe and prompted an extensive program of westernization, particularly under the leadership of Peter the Great. His massive efforts included vast administrative changes, the enlargement and modernization of Russian military forces, a new educational system for the sons of noblemen, and dozens of manufacturing enterprises. Russian nobles were instructed to dress in European style and to shave their sacred and much revered beards. The newly created capital city of St. Petersburg was to be Russia's window on the West. One of Peter's successors, Catherine the Great, followed up with further efforts to Europeanize Russian culture and intellectual life, viewing herself as part of the European Enlightenment. Thus, Russians were the first of many peoples to measure themselves against the West and to mount major catch-up efforts. But this European-oriented and Christian state had also become an Asian power, bumping up against China, India, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire. It was on the front lines of the encounter between Christendom and the world of Islam. This straddling of Asia and Europe was the source of a long-standing identity problem that has troubled educated Russians for 300 years. Was Russia a backward European country, destined to follow the lead of more highly developed Western European societies? Or was it different, uniquely Slavic or even Asian, shaped by its Mongol legacy and its status as an Asian power? It is a question that Russians have not completely answered even in the 21st century. Either way, the very size of that empire, bordering on virtually all of the great agrarian civilizations of outer Eurasia, turned Russia, like many empires before it, into a highly militarized state, a society organized for continuous war, according to one scholar. It also reinforced the highly autocratic character of the Russian Empire, because such a huge state arguably required a powerful monarchy to hold its vast domains and highly diverse peoples together. Clearly, the Russians had created an empire, similar to those of Western Europe in terms of conquest, settlement, exploitation, religious conversion, and feelings of superiority. Nonetheless, the Russians had acquired their empire under different circumstances than did the Western Europeans. The Spanish and the British had conquered and colonized the New World, an ocean away and wholly unknown to them before 1492. They acquired those empires only after establishing themselves as distinct European states. The Russians, on the other hand, absorbed adjacent territories, and they did so at the time that a modern Russian state was taking shape. The British had an empire, wrote historian Geoffrey Hosking. Russia was an empire. Perhaps this helps explain the unique longevity of the Russian Empire. Whereas the Spanish, Portuguese, and British colonies in the Americas long ago achieved independence, the Russian Empire remained intact until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So thorough was Russian colonization that Siberia and much of the steppes remained still an integral part of the Russian state.